what time will I need to be done this hour?
9:45.
Could be. Well, thank you for inviting me again to come back and be with you. Pleasure to be back in Columbus and see people that I don't get to see very often. I really appreciate those. Good to go. Thank you. I was coming just filling in, preaching for them. They did not have a local evangelist at the time. And so I was there usually on the first Sunday of the month. Well, they have a yearly theme and individual themes for each day in the year. And their theme that year was a church with a mind to work. And so on the first Sunday of the year, I presented these lessons, tried to address what was going to be a theme for them for that year. That is biblical language, isn't it? A mind to work. That's the statement that was made in Nehemiah, chapter 4 and verse 6, where Nehemiah was describing the efforts that the Jewish people were going to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and all of that after they had come back from their Babylonian captivity. And Nehemiah says in that verse, chapter 4, verse 6, so we built the wall, and the entire wall was joined together up to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. Just for curiosity, I looked at a few other translations, and some were in the nature of paraphrases, I guess, than a literal translation. But the Good News Bible says the people were eager to work. The New English Testament, the people were enthusiastic in their work. And the NIV said the people worked with all their heart. Well, those are just English phrases that get to the idea of what's in Nehemiah 4, verse 6. They had a great work to do that would involve a lot of people, and there was some need for them to get that done as soon as they could. So the fact that they had a mind to work, they were eager to do the work and get it finished, probably made the difference between that work being finished and not. So I want us to think about being a church, a congregation that has a mind to work. We certainly have a work to do in our own generation, don't we? And it will take all that any of us can do over the course of our lifetimes to participate in that. But having a mind to work points toward our attitude. We can choose to be that, people with a mind to work, rather than doing what we do with a grudging attitude and perhaps complaining about what has to be done. We need not only to be energetic in our work for the Lord, but to do that with an attitude that reflects the gratitude that we have even to be a part of the Lord's work. I really believe that it is a matter of choice, what attitude we have about whatever our part in the Lord's work might be. And I say that, our part in the Lord's work, I say that deliberately because I really do believe that all of us, in one way or another, are a part of the work that is going on within the congregations that we're at and in the various places where we live. It's just not true that whoever the preacher is or many congregations now have more than one preacher. It's not like they're doing the work of the Lord, and we pray for them and we support them to do what they do, and our role is just to support the work financially. Well, that's a part of it, certainly. But to some extent, every one of us is working in the same vineyard. You know, we all are a part of that. And there aren't really any small or little parts to the Lord's work. Anything that we would do in His work is important. And all of us need to have the attitude of being grateful for it and choosing that. Look at a couple of passages where we find some servants. These are both in the Old Testament, but the principle would be the same for us today. Back in Ezra chapter 7 and verse 16, where it was talking about Ezra's attitude about what he was doing as a Jewish person in that day. He said in chapter 7 and verse 10, for Ezra had prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord and to do it and to teach statutes and ordinances in Israel. The preachers are always on the lookout for 3-point lessons. Well, here's a verse that just serves it right up to you. Ezra had prepared his heart to seek the Lord. That has to be the first thing. And then second, he would do the law, the will of the Lord. That's number 2. And then third, he would pass that on to other people. He would teach the statutes and ordinances in Israel. Well, that's not only a good program for an individual, it's good for congregations. You know, in a congregational sense, to prepare our hearts, adjust our thinking however it needs to be adjusted so that we'll be good workers, and then to do the work that we've prepared our hearts to do, and then to teach that to somebody else. Really, the best motivator in the world is to be in the position of needing to teach somebody else. That just has a wonderful effect on us. Any of you who've ever been in any kind of teaching role understand that if you have the attitude about that you ought to have, it does more for you than it does your students because it's so motivating. A similar passage is over in Daniel, where Daniel, one of those who had been taken captive, to Babylon, with 3 of his friends who were in the same situation. They'd been identified as very promising, talented young men. So the Babylonian king had taken them into his own service and was going to prepare them with a certain diet, I guess, that he thought that would help in their work. But it involved eating some things that were unclean for Jewish people. And so rather than just go along with it, because an argument could be made that we're being forced to do this is not voluntary on our part, the statement is made in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies. And so he just decided up front, I'm not going to deviate from what he knew the Lord's will to be. As I've said before in regard to other topics, deciding to do what's right is more than half the battle. I think that was true certainly on that dark night time right before the Lord was crucified, when he spent his time in Gethsemane praying, agonizing over what was going to have to be done the next day, but having exactly the right attitude, that it's not a matter of his will, but yielding to the Father's will. I think once he had crossed that bridge and made the decision to drink the cup that was set before him, he was more than prepared to do what had to be done the next day after he had decided, given the assent of his will, to do it. The same thing's true for us. I think one of the reasons that we struggle sometimes, as we do in the Lord's work, is that we've really not made any kind of commitment to it. We haven't decided, voluntarily in our own minds to say yes to that commitment and then to do what we've committed ourselves to do. So I think a church can collectively decide to work harder at some things than they have in the past. Sometimes we just find that we've quit working as energetically as we used to, and we haven't seen the change. It's happened so gradually that we just don't see how much less we're giving ourselves to the Lord's work than might have been true 20 or 30 years ago. And so we have to dive in again and acknowledge that we've let things slip and make a commitment to rectifying that in the way that we ought to. But it is, after all, the Lord's work, isn't it? We use that phrase very frequently, especially those of us who preach and teach in a public capacity, the Lord's work. But it's important to remember that that's whose work it is. We are participating in it, but we're really followers of Him, servants of His, and we need to keep that in our minds. If we would ever, visibly have the Lord with us, in some kind of way that we could see, I think we would certainly be motivated to work as hard as we could. If He's right there with us, and we know that this is His work and all of that. But He is with us. Even if we can't see Him, He's with us in our assembly this morning. And it's still His work. It's about Him and not about us. The thing about it that we would give thankfulness for is that in His grace, He's allowed us to be involved in His work. So I'm sure you remember the very quotable statement that Paul made at the end of 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58, where he said, "My beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in" what? "The work of the Lord, knowing that your labor in the Lord is not in vain." That's a powerful verse that really says in the compass of one verse what I would like to say to you in these lessons today. And you might easily have profited just as much by spending the time looking at that verse as having me come up and try to talk about the point that's made there. We can decide to abound rather than to just get by on doing a bare minimum. One of the lessons that I was able to present up in Greenwood this past week, in fact, more than one of the lessons, we needed to talk about the fact that there is an individual aspect to what we do, but in addition, a congregation or a collective aspect of it. And so we need to enter into both sides of the Lord's work with great enthusiasm and energy. It's easy for us to get to where we're paying a lot of attention to one of those and very little the other. And so we need to rectify the balance when we get to that point. I was thinking just the other day about a sermon I heard several years ago by a brother who I think he was wanting to encourage his brethren to take the Lord's Day more seriously, to be present at the assemblies of the church and various other things. And he made great arguments, for the fact that the things the Lord has commanded us to do on the first day of the week in a collective sense, when we come together as a congregation, those are good for us. And the point of his lesson was we need, what the Lord has provided. on the first day of the week. But he said nothing in that lesson about anything that a person would do just individually on the first day of the week. Everything about it, he was encouraging the audience to take part in more fully, was congregational activity. Well, that emphasis needs to be made. Certainly a fact that many times the Lord's people don't faithfully participate in the assemblies of the church on the Lord's Day and all of that. But I'll tell you, the Lord's Day also needs to be a good day for us individually in our personal relationship to the Lord. And we can decide, to do that, both individually and congregationally. Several years ago when I lived down in Nashville, Tennessee, we had a flood in the city one spring, and our building where I was worshiping at the time was flooded, and so we were going to have to we couldn't worship in the building for about 2 months, maybe more than that. And so one of the other congregations nearby loaned us their building so we could meet on Sunday afternoon when they weren't there. And so for, I think, about 3 months, we worshiped at 3 o'clock in the afternoon by necessity. But I found over that time that I really enjoyed that from a spiritual standpoint. It allowed me, because I'm not a morning person, and so it's very hard for me to get up very early and have enough powers of concentration to study the scriptures or whatever. But if the Lord's people are not going to get together until 3 in the afternoon, that let me, sleep in fairly late and still have several hours ahead of me before it was time to go to the church building and profit from what was going to happen there. I had spent the morning, in prayer and studying the scriptures and I know that would work out differently if you were a family with small children. You wouldn't have the luxury of just meditating on the Lord's will. But I found it a very helpful thing to do, to be doing activities on my own that would lead up at the afternoon hour to coming together with my fellow Christians. I felt more prepared. I really looked forward to the assembly more when I'd had some time earlier in the day to do some things individually that were good for me. But regardless of the schedule, we all need to pay attention to what the Lord wants us to be doing as a local congregation without neglecting what he wants us to do in an individual sense. And depending on how old you are and what's going on in your personal life, one or the other of those may be harder for you to be motivated to do and to be as energetic as you ought to do. Maybe you find the individual part of life in Christ more challenging at this point in your life, and that's where you would need to turn up the motivation a little bit. Or maybe it's the congregational part of your life that the preacher needs to preach about to make sure you come for the assemblies of the church. Depending on who you are, what's going on in your life, maybe even what time of year it is, you may find that changing. A few months ago, you may have needed to hear sermons that emphasize the individual part of your life, and then you may, a few weeks after that, need lessons on the other side of it. So the Lord's work involves all that he wants us to be participating in, whether it's private or it's public in nature. And several of you were up at Greenwood Friday night when I was talking about the importance of evangelism in our individual lives and also as local congregations. That's not all there is. If a church has a mind to work, evangelism is not all they're going to be doing. But I maintain that it is one of the more important components of it, if not the most important piece of the puzzle. Not anything we would need to be prepared to work hard at than the work of getting the Lord's work out of this building into the community around us. all of us could turn up the energy level a little bit there as evangelists. But as I tried to emphasize Friday night in regard to evangelism, not every member does exactly the same thing in that work or any other aspect of the Lord's work. All of us have very unique situations in regard to everything. When you think about how different we are sometimes, it's amazing that the Lord would have set up his kingdom in the way that he did. I mean, some of us are people who we wouldn't have anything to do with some of the other people in this room if we didn't have the Lord in common. And in some congregations, there's even more diversity than what you would have here. It's a marvel that those people can work together and worship together without fighting. And you might well say, well, I know some congregations where the fighting is going on. But when it's going along as the Lord wanted it to, and we are willing to work together, each of us participating in some kind of a way, regardless of how that compares to what somebody else is doing, even when it gets approximately close to being how the Lord wanted it to go, we can see the wisdom that he had in setting it up this way. It forces us to keep focused on him, and then that causes us to think rightly about the work that we are doing together. Let's read those two passages that some of you who were there Friday night heard us talk about, emphasizing the fact that we each have different things to do in the Lord's work. First of all, in Romans chapter 12, it's easy to remember both of these passages because they're both in chapters 12 of their individual books. Romans chapter 12, we'll start at verse 3. Paul says, "For I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. For as we have many members in one body, but all the members do not have the same function, so we, being many, as we who are Christians, are one body in Christ and individually members of one another." And so then just go ahead and turn over to 1 Corinthians 12. And in the passage of 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul emphasizes that these various abilities are there because the Lord put them there. Not any of us who can argue that I am a self-made person, and whatever I can do, I prepared myself to do it, and it's me this and me that. Well, ultimately, none of us would be able to do anything if the Lord had not made that possible. And so whatever variety there is among us, that variety is not bad. That's good because the Lord put it there. I suppose he could have made all of us just exactly identical to everybody else, but he didn't. And so in 1 Corinthians 12, starting at verse 15, he said, "If the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I'm not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? And if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I'm not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? If the whole body were an eye, where would be the hearing? If the whole were hearing, where would be the smelling? But now God has set the members, each one of them, in the body, just as he pleased." Well, it helps, doesn't it, to think of the local congregation in that kind of way. That you can do what you can do, and I can do what I can do, and we're to work together because that's the way the Lord set it up. That's the way he wants it to be. And I I don't know exactly how to help you decide what you can do in the Lord's work and what the Lord will expect you to have done before your time is up. But I think it's a good exercise for all of us. Maybe at least once a year. I try to do it on New Year's Eve every year. I don't go to any parties on New Year's Eve. For many years, that has been my time to just turn off all the noise, have a private evening before the new year starts the next day, and to think about some of these things. What abilities has the Lord provided in my life? And what do I need to do a better job of using in this brand new year that will start in a few hours, so that when the time comes eventually for me to give an accounting to the Lord of how I've used whatever abilities he gave me, how can I do better about that before the accounting comes on the day of judgment? And we probably ought to do that more than just once a year. But that's sometimes a humbling exercise, isn't it? And the reason I do that privately is because that requires me to think about what my abilities are. To face those honestly enough and understand that I can't wiggle out from underneath the responsibility that goes with those things, but I can get a fresh grip and think very specifically how, in the coming year, how am I going to use whatever the Lord has made possible in my life, how am I going to use that in this coming year better than I did in the year just past? So I guess merchants call that taking stock, where you, at regular intervals, you look at what the resources are, how much you've got to sell, how much more you need to get from your wholesale dealer and all of that. That has to be done from time to time. Take stock of our part in the Lord's will. And I don't know if I've ever known a congregation that did this, but I think that'd be a pretty good exercise for a local church to do, wouldn't it? Maybe every year. Just to meet together, maybe on an informal basis, where everybody would have the opportunity to talk, and to just have a very honest session of thinking about ourselves as a local congregation. Not in a complaining sense, and certainly not in an arrogant or proud sense to say, here's what we can do. Hasn't the Lord richly blessed us with abilities? But just to very honestly acknowledge what our resources are, and maybe also our deficiencies, how we're going to help to rectify those weak spots, so that in the coming period of time, whether that's a year or some other interval, we're not just going to say we need to do better at 25th Street, but specifically to say, here is how we want to do better. And here are the plans that we have made to carry that out. It'd be a wonderful exercise for a congregation as well as an individual exercise. I mean, the diversities that exist among the Lord's saints, that would be a recipe for disaster if it was anything other than the Lord's work. I mean, if you think about even the church in Jerusalem immediately after Pentecost. The group of the Lord's people there for a while, would have been pretty similar to one another. They were all Jewish. They had all just recently been baptized into Christ. And so this whole thing was a new thing for them. But even among them as Jewish people, you would have seen some differences that if they weren't handled very carefully could have been just a catastrophe. A lot of people, I think, don't realize how much diversity there was among the Jewish people in the first century, particularly a difference between Jews that were, they lived more in Jerusalem and the immediate environs of Jerusalem, while others lived in places further away. And so it's this difference between the homeland people and those people who live in other parts of the Roman Empire. They were called the Hellenistic Jews because most of them had acquired Jewish, tastes in how they dressed, and they spoke the Greek language rather than Hebrew, and had typically a much more liberal, I guess, outlook is what you'd call it, in regard to everything than the relatively more rustic brethren that they had back in Jerusalem, who were not quite as sophisticated, but who would resist these worldly trends of their brethren out there in the diaspora and the Roman Empire to accommodate Roman ways. And you speak Greek, and you've compromised your Jewishness in all of these ways. Well, in Jerusalem, there were multiple synagogues. And it wasn't just because some of them, wanted to worship near where they lived and wouldn't have to walk all the way across the city. Their synagogues were just as different as our congregations are. And so most Jews would go to a synagogue where it was how they thought it ought to be, doctrinally and in practice as well. Well, imagine some of those, those Jews coming to Christ on the day of Pentecost, some from a very, very rural, kind of rustic, conservative environment of Judaism. And now we also had some Hellenistic Jews who, of course, had been in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, from all over the Roman Empire. And those who obeyed the gospel were very willing to stay there for a while before they went back home. Imagine them now as Christians having to relate to one another as equals when they would have been anything but that back in their Jewish walk of life. Well, of course, sadly, we realize that it didn't take long after that before, even as Christians, they started bickering among themselves about some new differences that they have in regard to Christianity that they didn't have before they obeyed the gospel. And so in places like Antioch, where the congregation was made up of just anybody and everybody, racially and ethnically and educational levels and differences in income and all of that, it is a marvel that those people were able to worship together rather than killing one another, as people tend to do, in the unbelieving world, when they're supposed to be working together but they can't agree, and so they don't have anything to do but to fight. And I suppose, though we don't know as much about the congregation in Rome, I think we would have to assume that the congregation in Rome, because that was the seat of the empire and people there from literally all over the world, every walk of life that you could imagine, that the congregation in Rome would have been a motley crew, to use a crude expression. I mean, if they could get along together, then anybody could, because they'd come from very different backgrounds. And in Rome, they would have come to Rome from very different parts of the empire. So again, a recipe for disaster if they didn't have a mind to work in the Lord and to keep the emphasis on the Lord rather than on their individual diversity. And so, it's no surprise that we see encouragements and admonitions in almost all of the letters in the New Testament to be one in Christ. Work together. Consider the other person, better than yourself. Even in Philippians, which is the most, I think, peaceful letter in the New Testament. The work in Philippi seems to have been going much better than in places like Corinth, But even in his letter to the Philippians, Paul had to deal with a little bit of strife that was going on there. And he said, you remind these two sisters to work together in the Lord. I don't know what their issue was, but they weren't handling it in a very peaceful way. And Paul had to remind them, this is about the Lord and his work. So lay aside your differences and have a mind to work together. And so you would have passages in it like the one in Ephesians chapter 4, where Paul reminds them of the need to be unified in the Lord's work. Let's start reading at verse 11 of Ephesians 4. He himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors, that is shepherds and teachers. Why? Verse 12, for the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry. You see the point already in just what we've read, right? The reason people have those different roles and responsibilities and just abilities is not for their own benefit, but so that each of them could use what they've got to prepare the saints for various service. Service is what the word ministry means. For the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect, a complete man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, that we should no longer be children, tossed to and fro, and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the trickery of men and the cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting, but speaking the truth in love may grow up in all things into him who is the head. And verse 16 is about as beautiful a snapshot of the way the Lord wants it to be in a local congregation than verse 16 of Ephesians 4. Here's the goal. Speaking of Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by what every joint supplies, according to the effective working by which every part does its share, what results from that? It causes growth of the body for the edifying of itself in love. Now, that's just a wonderful picture there in those verses, isn't it? Of what the Lord has provided so that his people can be one in the Lord, and then the responsibility on the part of the servants to use what God has provided in such a way that contributes to the body growing up spiritually, not just numerically, but spiritually becoming more mature. But almost every phrase in that passage emphasizes the responsibility of people not just to work, but to work together, keeping Christ in the center of the whole thing. I don't know of a congregation that couldn't profit by reading this passage and making the applicable commitments wherever the church might be, whether it's here or it's in Kentucky or it's in Zimbabwe or wherever. I mean, that passage tells us not only what the Lord wants to be taking place, but what he has provided to make that possible. But it doesn't take place unless we decide that that's the way we're going to be about the Lord's work. Because if we don't pay frequent attention, coming back to these fundamental principles of unity in the Lord's work, what happens over time if we don't keep coming back and reminding ourselves of this? It falls apart, doesn't it? Anything left to itself disintegrates over time. It's amazing to me that anybody who's ever owned a house could believe in the theory of evolution. That just left to itself, things go to a higher and higher state of order and complexity. No, left to themselves, things fall apart. You know that from your house, don't you? You neglect its maintenance, it doesn't get better over time, it gets worse. The same thing is true of us in our various local congregations where we work and worship. So we've got to commit ourselves to being a church with a mind, not just to work, but to work in the unity of the Spirit. having decided that we're going to be that way in using the resources that the Lord has given us. So there are always going to be obstacles and opposition to our work. And I love the statement that Paul made in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 9, when he said that he was going to remain where he was for a while, and he wouldn't be able to see them in Corinth, because he said there's an open door here, and there are many adversaries. A lot of us think opportunity would mean there aren't any adversaries here, so it would be easy to do the Lord's work here. No, opportunity and opposition go hand in hand. Let's face it, the same physical circumstances that are conducive to the spread of the gospel are conducive to the devil spreading his gospel. So you'd expect in any environment where there's great opportunity, there's also going to be a lot of challenge to that. But we commit ourselves as the Lord's people to doing his work in his way. So our time is up, I believe, and in the next hour I have to turn the page and look at part 2 of this subject. You may think I've already said all that you need to hear about this, and I suppose if that's the case, you just go get donuts and coffee somewhere else. Just kidding. You stay here. But there are some other things we need to say about being a church with a mind to work. Thanks for hanging in there and listening this far. Good to see you again.